A racist cop arrests a black female FBI agent. He is hit with karma when he discovers who she really is. It was an unusually quiet afternoon in the city, the kind of day that Officer Leo Miller dreaded. With fewer cars on the road and less commotion in the streets, Miller felt bored and restless. As he cruised through the wealthier side of town, his attention was caught by a sleek black SUV pulling out of a high-end neighborhood. His eyes narrowed. A black woman sat behind the wheel, dressed professionally, but something about the scene made his pulse quicken. The image didn't fit his narrow-minded view of the world. A black woman driving such an expensive vehicle didn't sit right with him. Without a second thought, he flicked on his siren and pulled the SUV over. As he approached the car, his hand hovered near his belt, his other hand gripping the edge of his holster, a subtle gesture of intimidation. The woman inside glanced up at her rearview mirror, her expression calm but slightly annoyed. She didn't seem rattled by the flashing lights, which irritated Miller even more. He reached the driver's side window, tapping on it with 2 fingers. The woman rolled the window down, her hands resting on the steering wheel in plain sight. "License and registration," Miller demanded coldly, skipping any formal greeting. The woman nodded and calmly handed over her documents without hesitation. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Miller didn't respond right away. Instead, he glanced at the license in his hand, noting her name. Ada Simmons. He frowned. It didn't mean anything to him, but that wasn't important. What mattered was that she didn't belong here, not in his mind. "Where are you headed?" he asked, his tone harsh and accusatory. "To work," she replied, her calm demeanor unshaken. There was something about her tone that annoyed Miller, a quiet confidence that didn't fit the narrative he was crafting in his head. He looked at her through narrowed eyes. "This your car?" Ada blinked, clearly taken aback by the insinuation. "Yes, officer. It's mine." Miller's suspicion only deepened. He couldn't stand the fact that she wasn't nervous, wasn't afraid of him. To him, that was a sign she was hiding something. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered abruptly. Ada sighed softly but complied, unbuckling her seatbelt and opening the door. She stepped out gracefully, her posture tall and confident. Her calmness in the face of his aggressive behavior only seemed to enrage him further. "Why am I being asked to step out of my vehicle?" she asked, keeping her voice measured but firm. Miller stepped closer, invading her personal space. "I'll ask the questions here," he snapped, his hand still hovering near his gun. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? You fit the description of someone we've been looking for." Ada raised an eyebrow, her eyes locking onto his with a quiet intensity. "I don't know what description you're referring to, officer, but I assure you, I'm not the person you're looking for." Miller's face twisted in frustration. "Turn around. Hands behind your back," he barked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of a couple of bystanders nearby. Ada's jaw tightened, but she didn't resist. She knew how quickly things could escalate in situations like this. She turned slowly, placing her hands behind her back, as Miller roughly grabbed her wrists and slapped the cuffs on. "This is unnecessary," she said calmly, glancing over her shoulder at him. "If you just run my ID, you'll realize—" "Save it," Miller cut her off. "We'll sort this out at the station." He marched her to his patrol car, feeling a grim satisfaction as he placed her in the back seat. He didn't care that she had offered no resistance, that she had been nothing but cooperative. In his mind, she was guilty of something. He just had to figure out what. As he pulled away from the scene, his mind raced. Who was she really? What was she hiding? He ignored the sinking feeling in his gut, the one that whispered he might be making a mistake. Instead, he focused on getting her back to the station, where he could run her through the system and finally prove that his suspicions had been right all along. But as he glanced in the rearview mirror, he saw Ada sitting calmly in the back seat, her expression unbothered, almost as if she knew something he didn't. The drive to the station was tense, but the silence was deafening. Officer Miller gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles turning white as he stole glances at the rearview mirror. Ada Simmons sat calmly in the back seat, her hands still cuffed behind her. She was composed, unshaken, which only fueled his irritation. As they passed through the city streets, Miller's mind raced. He didn't understand why this woman was so calm. Why wasn't she panicking? Why wasn't she begging him to let her go? Most people in her position would be nervous, pleading their case, but not Ada. Her stillness unnerved him. "What are you so calm about?" Miller muttered under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. He was used to being in control of situations like this, and her calm demeanor felt like a challenge to his authority. Ada didn't respond at first. She simply gazed out the window, her expression unreadable. Finally she spoke, her voice measured and soft. "There's no need to be frantic. You'll figure out soon enough who I am." The cryptic remark made Miller's heart skip a beat, though he quickly masked his discomfort with a scowl. "Oh yeah?" he shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "And just who do you think you are?" Ada met his gaze through the rearview mirror, her eyes calm, but firm. "You'll see." Her tone was polite but firm, and it left Miller seething. He gripped the wheel tighter, trying to shake off the growing unease gnawing at his insides. He had to stay in control. After all, he was the one with the authority, the one who made the rules. They arrived at the station, and Miller quickly pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out of the car and opened the back door, yanking Ada out by her arm. The roughness of his touch didn't go unnoticed, but she didn't react. She simply followed his lead, her expression unchanged. As they entered the station, a few officers glanced up, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. Miller was known for being aggressive in his arrests, but there was something different about this situation. Whispers floated around the room as the officers watched Miller drag a well-dressed black woman toward the booking desk. She didn't look like the usual suspects Miller brought in. "Name?" the booking officer asked, glancing up at Ada as she stood in front of him, her hands still cuffed. "Ada Simmons," she replied evenly. The officer blinked in recognition, his eyes widening slightly as he looked up at her. He seemed to know something Miller didn't, but Miller was too focused on his own narrative to notice. "Charges?" the booking officer asked, turning his attention back to Miller. Miller smirked. "Suspicion of illegal activity. Resisting arrest." Ada raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. She knew better than to argue at this stage. There was no point. The truth would come out soon enough, and she didn't need to defend herself in a room full of people who wouldn't listen. The booking officer hesitated for a moment before looking back at Ada, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. He handed the paperwork over to another officer and muttered something under his breath before stepping away from the desk. Miller didn't think much of it, assuming the other officer was just slow to process the arrest. As Ada was led away to a holding cell, the whispers in the station grew louder. Miller noticed the shift in energy but ignored it, convincing himself that he had done the right thing. He had followed procedure, after all. This woman had given him a reason to be suspicious, or at least that's what he kept telling himself. Once Ada was locked in the cell, Miller returned to his desk to begin processing the arrest. He felt a twinge of satisfaction as he typed in her name and entered the charges. He'd finally put her in her place. But then, something unexpected happened. As Miller continued typing, his computer screen flashed with a security alert, prompting him to enter a special clearance code to access Ada Simmons' records. Confused, he frowned and entered his credentials, only to be met with a message that read, "Access denied. Restricted federal information." Miller's heart skipped a beat. Federal information? Why would she have federal clearance? He glanced nervously around the room, realizing that something was wrong. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do next. Just as he was about to try again, his superior, Sergeant Collins, approached his desk, his face pale and tight with concern. "Miller, we need to talk," Collins said, his voice low and urgent. Miller blinked, confused. "What's going on?" Collins leaned in, his voice barely a whisper. "You just arrested an FBI agent." Miller felt the blood drain from his face. "What? That can't be right. She's Assistant Director Ada Simmons," Collins cut him off, his voice tense. "One of the highest-ranking agents in the FBI." Miller's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to process the information. Everything around him seemed to blur, his mind racing. The woman he had just humiliated, arrested, and thrown into a holding cell wasn't just anyone. She was one of the most powerful law enforcement officials in the country. I didn't know," Miller stammered, his voice shaky. Collins sighed heavily, rubbing his temples. "Well, now you do. And if she presses charges, your career is over. You need to think very carefully about your next move, Miller. This isn't going to go away quietly." Miller's mind spun. The arrogance and superiority he had felt just moments ago were now replaced with panic and regret. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, and now he was facing the consequences in the most brutal way possible. As Collins walked away, Miller stared at his computer screen, the words "restricted federal information" glaring back at him like a warning. He had no idea how bad things were about to get, but one thing was clear. Karma was coming for him. Officer Leo Miller sat frozen at his desk, the words FBI Assistant Director Ada Simmons repeating in his mind like a broken record. He stared blankly at his computer screen, unable to comprehend the magnitude of his mistake. How could this have happened? How could he have been so wrong? A wave of nausea washed over him as the realization sank in. This wasn't some ordinary civilian he had arrested. This was one of the highest-ranking agents in the FBI, a woman with the power to dismantle his career with a single phone call. The weight of his arrogance and prejudice now felt like an anchor dragging him down. Miller's mind raced as he tried to think of a way out of the situation, but every option seemed worse than the last. He couldn't undo what he had done. The arrest had been made, and Ada was currently sitting in a holding cell, probably thinking about how she would destroy him once she was released. His breath quickened as panic set in. Just then, Sergeant Collins reappeared, his face grim and his tone sharp. "Miller, the FBI is on their way." Miller's heart plummeted. "What do you mean they're on their way?" Collins's voice was cold, laced with disappointment. "They've already been informed about the arrest. We're about to have some very high-profile visitors in this station, and you better believe they're not happy." Miller stood up, his legs shaky beneath him. "Sergeant, I didn't know—" "Exactly," Collins interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "You didn't know because you didn't bother to check. You made assumptions based on her appearance, didn't you? You let your bias dictate your actions." Miller tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. His mouth felt dry, and he could feel his pulse pounding in his temples. Collins didn't wait for a response. "You need to go to her," Collins ordered, his tone hard. "Now. Apologize. Explain. Do whatever you need to do. This situation is spiraling out of control, and if you don't act fast, it's going to be the end of you." Without another word, Miller hurried out of the room, his mind in overdrive. He made his way to the holding cells, where Ada Simmons sat calmly behind the bars, her expression unreadable. Unlike most detainees, she wasn't pacing or shouting for attention. She sat with an eerie calm, as if she was merely waiting for the inevitable. When Miller reached her, he hesitated, his hand gripping the cell door. "Agent Simmons," he began, his voice shaky. I didn't know." Ada lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes with a piercing stare that made Miller's skin crawl. There was no rage, no anger, just a cool, detached look that sent a chill down his spine. "That's the problem," she said softly, her voice calm but full of weight. "You didn't bother to know. You made assumptions, and now here we are." Miller swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he unlocked the cell door. He stepped inside, feeling smaller with each step. "I made a mistake," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I let my assumptions get the better of me. I'm sorry." Ada didn't respond right away. She simply stood up and walked toward him, her movements deliberate and composed. She was now just inches away from him, her presence towering over him despite her shorter stature. "I've been an FBI agent for over 15 years, she said. Quietly, her eyes never leaving his, she said, "I've worked cases that would make your head spin. I've faced criminals, terrorists, and threats you couldn't even imagine. But none of that matters to you, does it?" Miller opened his mouth to respond, but she continued, "You didn't see me as a person. You didn't see my credentials, my experience, or my authority. All you saw was a black woman behind the wheel of a nice car, And that was enough for you to make your decision. Isn't that right? Miller's throat tightened. He couldn't argue. He couldn't deny the truth. She was speaking it as if she had seen right through him from the moment he pulled her over. Ada stepped back slightly, her expression softening just a fraction. I've dealt with officers like you my entire life. This isn't new to me. What's different now is that you're in over your head, and you know it. Miller's heart pounded in his chest, his mind screaming for him to do something, to say something, but all he could do was stand there helpless. Ada sighed softly and crossed her arms. You're lucky, you know. I have the power to ruin you right now, to make sure your name is dragged through the mud, to see you stripped of your badge and disgraced. But I'm not going to do that. Miller blinked in surprise. You're not? Ada's eyes narrowed slightly. No, because this isn't just about you. It's about the system that allows officers like you to thrive, the system that tells you it's okay to make assumptions, to treat people differently because of how they look. You're just a symptom of a much bigger problem. Miller's shoulders sagged under the weight of her words. He had never seen it that way. To him, being a cop had always been about enforcing the law, maintaining order. But now, standing in front of Ada Simmons, he saw the world through a different lens, one where his authority wasn't always right, where his actions had consequences far beyond his own understanding. You're going to face consequences, Officer Miller, Ada continued, her voice firm, but not unkind. But whether or not you learn from this is up to you. You can choose to stay the same, to let this be a bump in the road, or you can open your eyes and start seeing people for who they are, not who you assume them to be. Miller felt the sting of her words deeply. He had spent his entire career believing he was in the right, that his instincts were what made him a good cop. But now, those same instincts had led him to the edge of ruin. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice cracking with sincerity. I really am. Ada studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. We'll see if you mean that. Just as the conversation ended, the door to the holding area swung open and 3 FBI agents entered, their faces set in grim determination. Miller stepped back, feeling a fresh wave of panic as they approached. Assistant Director Simmons, one of the agents said, nodding respectfully. We're here to take you out of this mess. Ada glanced at Miller one last time before turning to the agents. Thank you, she said calmly. Let's go. As they escorted her out of the station, Miller stood frozen, watching as the woman he had wrongfully arrested was whisked away by the very institution he had insulted with his prejudice, his stomach twisted with regret, knowing that whatever happened next was out of his hands. The storm was coming, and Officer Leo Miller was standing directly in its path. The atmosphere inside the station had shifted dramatically. Whispers echoed through the halls as officers exchanged nervous glances. News of Officer Miller's arrest of FBI Assistant Director Ada Simmons had spread like wildfire, reaching every corner of the precinct. Even those who didn't typically pay attention to the day-to-day drama were now watching, waiting to see what would happen next. Officer Miller sat at his desk, numb. The full weight of his actions was beginning to settle in, and it felt like the walls were closing in on him. His phone buzzed with messages from colleagues, some asking what had happened, others simply offering terse condolences, but none of them knew the full story yet. None of them knew just how deeply he had screwed up. He couldn't stop thinking about his last interaction with Ada, the way she had spoken to him, calm but firm, pointing out the truth that he had tried so hard to ignore. The more he replayed the conversation in his head, the more he realized how blind he had been, how much his assumptions had controlled his actions. Suddenly, the door to the precinct swung open, and all eyes turned as a group of suited figures strode in. At the center of the group was Special Agent Robert Palmer, a senior FBI official known for his no-nonsense attitude. Behind him were 2 other agents, all walking with purpose. The station fell into an uncomfortable silence as the FBI agents made their way to the captain's office. Sergeant Collins followed closely behind, his face tight with anxiety. It was clear to everyone that the situation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. Miller's stomach churned as he watched them disappear behind the closed office door. He knew what was happening in that room. His fate was being discussed, and it didn't look good. Minutes felt like hours as the rest of the station buzzed quietly, waiting for the fallout. Miller's mind raced with worst-case scenarios. Would he lose his badge? Would this go public? Would he face criminal charges for wrongful arrest? The thought of losing everything he had worked for made his chest tighten. After what felt like an eternity, the door to the captain's office opened, and the FBI agents emerged. Special Agent Palmer's face was set in a hard line as he scanned the room, his gaze briefly landing on Miller. The look in his eyes sent a cold shiver down Miller's spine. Palmer exchanged a few quiet words with Collins before turning and heading back toward the exit. As they left, Collins made a beeline for Miller's desk, his expression grim. "Come with me," Collins said, his voice low but firm. Miller swallowed hard and stood, his legs feeling like lead as he followed his sergeant back to the office. Once inside, Collins shut the door behind them, and the tension in the room became suffocating. "Miller, you've put us all in a very difficult position," Collins began, his tone measured but clearly frustrated. "The FBI is not happy, not at all." Miller dropped his gaze to the floor, unable to meet Collins's eyes. "I know. I didn't realize. That's the problem." Collins interrupted, his voice rising slightly. "You didn't realize because you didn't bother to look past your own damn biases. You acted on impulse, and now the FBI is breathing down our necks." Miller shifted uncomfortably, the weight of guilt crushing him. "Are they going to press charges?" Collins sighed heavily and leaned against his desk. "For now, they're holding off on any formal charges. Ada Simmons, Agent Simmons, has decided not to take legal action at this time, but don't think for a second that you're in the clear." Miller looked up, his heart pounding. "She's not pressing charges?" Collins shook his head, his expression tightening. "Not yet," Collins said, his voice dark, "but she made it very clear that she expects you to face the consequences within the department. And believe me, the FBI isn't going to just let this slide. There's a formal investigation underway, and they'll be watching your every move from now on." Miller felt a flicker of relief at the news that Ada wasn't pursuing criminal charges, but it was quickly extinguished by the realization that his career was still hanging by a thread. "The media hasn't caught wind of this yet," Collins continued, his tone sharp. "But if they do, this whole precinct will be under fire, and if that happens, you're going to be the face of this mess." Miller's stomach twisted at the thought. He had always been proud of his position, of the power and authority that came with the badge. But now that same badge felt like a noose tightening around his neck. I'll make it right," Miller stammered, though he wasn't even sure what that meant. Collins's expression softened slightly, but there was still a hard edge to his voice. "You've got a lot of work to do, Miller. This isn't just about keeping your job. It's about fixing the damage you've caused, not just to Agent Simmons, but to the department, to the community. You're going to be under a microscope, and you better be ready for that." Miller nodded slowly, the gravity of the situation sinking in deeper. He wasn't just fighting to save his career anymore. He was fighting to save his reputation, his sense of self. Collins stood up, signaling the end of the conversation. "Take some time off. Get your head straight. When you come back, things are going to be different around here." Miller left the office, his mind spinning as he walked back to his desk. He could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him, some filled with curiosity, others with judgment. He sat down heavily, staring at the blank screen in front of him, his thoughts racing. He had always believed that being a cop was about enforcing the law, about being in control, but now, he realized just how fragile that control was. He had been blind to the biases that shaped his actions, and now, for the first time, he was being forced to confront the ugly truth. That evening, as Miller sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of the day pressed down on him like never before. He couldn't escape the image of Ada Simmons sitting calmly in the holding cell, her words echoing in his mind. "You didn't see me as a person." Miller had always thought of himself as a good cop, fair, tough by the book. But now he realized that his version of by the book had been tainted by his own biases, his own prejudices. He had let those biases control him, and now he was paying the price. Just as he was about to pour himself a drink, his phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, and his heart nearly stopped when he saw the name on the screen. Ada Simmons. For a moment he hesitated, unsure of what to do. But then he gathered his courage and answered. "Officer Miller." Ada's calm voice came through the line. "I'm calling to let you know that I've spoken to the higher-ups. They're willing to let you keep your job for now." Miller let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding. "Thank you, Agent Simmons. I'm sorry for—" "You've already apologized," she interrupted, her voice sharp but not unkind. "Now it's time to prove that you've learned something. Words don't mean much without action, officer. I'll be watching." Miller swallowed hard. "I understand." "Good," Ada said simply, and with that, the call ended. Miller sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking in. His career had been spared, for now, but he knew that this was only the beginning. He would be under constant scrutiny, both from the FBI and his own department. The tables had turned, and Officer Leo Miller was no longer the one in control. The days that followed were a whirlwind of confusion, tension, and mounting dread. The FBI investigation into Officer Leo Miller's conduct was in full swing, and the once confident officer found himself under constant scrutiny. What had once been a familiar environment in the precinct now felt hostile, with whispers and sideways glances following him wherever he went. Miller's name had spread quickly, both within the department and beyond. It wasn't long before word leaked to the media. Though the details were still murky to the public, the fact that a high-ranking FBI agent had been wrongfully arrested by a local officer became front-page news. Headlines screamed about racial profiling and abuse of power, and Miller's face began to appear on local news segments. The coverage was relentless, portraying him as the embodiment of everything wrong with modern policing. At home, things weren't any better. Miller found himself isolated, his phone buzzing constantly with messages from colleagues, friends, and even strangers who had seen the news. Most of the messages ranged from disbelief to outright condemnation, and it became clear that Miller's reputation had been severely damaged. His wife, Sarah, had been distant ever since the news broke. While she hadn't openly criticized him, Miller could sense the growing tension between them. She had always supported him in his career, but this scandal had shaken her faith in him. Every conversation they had felt stilted, like they were walking on eggshells. One evening, after another grueling day at the station, Miller sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the television. Sarah sat across from him, the tension palpable. "You've barely said anything since this all started," she said softly, her eyes searching his face. "Do you even understand what you've done?" Miller clenched his jaw, the shame and frustration he'd been holding back finally surfacing. "Of course I understand, Sarah. I screwed up. I let my assumptions get the better of me." Sarah's gaze softened slightly, but there was still a distance between them. "I know you, Leo. You're a good man, but this isn't something you can just apologize for and move on. You've hurt people. You've put us all in a position where we have to face the consequences of your actions." Miller rubbed his temples, feeling the weight of everything pressing down on him. He had spent years believing he was doing the right thing, upholding the law, maintaining order, but now all of that felt hollow. For the first time, he was forced to confront the fact that his actions had real, lasting consequences on the people he had sworn to protect. "I don't know what to do," he admitted, his voice cracking with vulnerability. Sarah leaned forward, her voice softer but firm. "You need to make this right, Leo. Not just for yourself, but for everyone you've affected. You've been given a second chance. Don't waste it." At the precinct, things continued to unravel. The investigation had left Miller under constant supervision, and even though he hadn't been suspended, he was no longer trusted to patrol alone. His once solid standing among his peers had been shattered, and he could feel the judgment in every interaction. Officers who used to joke with him now kept their distance, and some outright avoided him. The media attention only made things worse. Every time Miller stepped outside, He could feel the eyes of reporters and passers-by on him, as if they were waiting for him to stumble, to give them more fodder for the narrative that had already been crafted. One afternoon, as Miller sat at his desk trying to focus on paperwork, his phone buzzed. It was a notification from a local news outlet. He hesitated for a moment before clicking the link, and what he saw made his stomach drop. The headline read, Officer Leo Miller. The headline read, The Face of Racial Profiling in Local Police Department. The article detailed his wrongful arrest of Ada Simmons, painting him as a glaring example of systemic racism in law enforcement. It wasn't just a hit piece, it was a damning critique of his entire career. Miller's heart pounded as he scrolled through the article, each sentence feeling like a punch to the gut. The media had taken his mistake and turned it into a symbol of everything wrong with the police force. While some of the criticism felt exaggerated, Miller couldn't deny that he had contributed to the problem. As he closed the article, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a message from one of his oldest friends on the force. Leo, you need to lay low. People are talking. The FBI is not done with you and the department's starting to distance themselves. Be careful, man. Miller stared at the message, the cold reality settling in. He had become a liability, not just to himself, but to everyone around him. His career was hanging by a thread, and there was nothing he could do to stop the freefall. Later that day, as Miller sat alone in the break room, Sergeant Collins entered, his expression grim. He walked over to Miller and sat down across from him, his tone more measured than it had been in previous conversations. Miller, the higher-ups have made their decision, Collins said, his voice steady, but not unkind. You're being put on indefinite leave. The media is too focused on this, and the department needs to protect itself. We're not firing you, but you're out until further notice. Miller's stomach twisted in knots. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words still hit him like a freight train. He opened his mouth to protest, to fight back, but no words came. There was nothing left to say. He had brought this on himself. Collins sighed, leaning back in his chair. Look, Leo, this isn't the end of the line for you. You still have a chance to make things right, but it's going to take a lot of work. This isn't just about your job anymore. It's about rebuilding the trust you've lost. Miller nodded slowly, the weight of the situation sinking deeper. He had spent years on the force believing in his own version of justice, but now the tables had turned, and he was the one facing judgment. The days dragged on after Miller was placed on leave. He found himself with too much time to think, too much time to dwell on his mistakes. Every news story, every conversation, every glance from a stranger felt like a reminder of his failure. But in the midst of the chaos, Miller began to realize that this wasn't just about him. It was about something much larger. A system that had allowed him to act without accountability for too long had finally pushed back, and now, Miller had to decide whether he would learn from his mistakes or let them define him. As he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, his phone buzzed with a familiar number. It was Ada Simmons. For a moment, he hesitated, unsure if he was ready to face her again. But then he answered. Officer Miller. Ada's voice was calm, just as it had been the last time they spoke. I've been watching the news. It looks like karma's catching up to you. Miller exhaled deeply. Yeah, you could say that. There was a brief pause before Ada spoke again. You've been given a second chance, Miller. Don't waste it. Miller nodded, even though she couldn't see him. I won't. Ada's voice softened. Good. Let's see if you can live up to that. And with that, the call ended, leaving Miller alone with his thoughts once again. But this time, he felt something different, a flicker of determination. The road ahead was long, but for the first time, Miller understood what was at stake. He had faced karma, and now it was time to decide what kind of man he wanted to be.